The first heat arrived with a hush, the kind that makes a man hear his own pulse. The desert didn't shout its warnings. It showed them in the bright slash of sun on mica and the long breath of wind that lifted dust in veils along the ranch road. By noon, the wind would chime through the tangle of old baling wire on the fence line, and by evening, the coyotes would leave pencil-thin tracks in the wash behind the horse corral. Out past the north fence, the land unrolled in faded gold, speckled with blackbrush and ocotillo, and farther yet, beyond the low basalt seam he used for prone practice, nothing but mirage and sky. He rose before sunrise because that is what the body does when it has outlived everybody else in its platoon. The kettle rattled once on the iron stove and fell still. The dog, half shepherd, half something desert-born and stubborn, lifted her head and thumped her tail twice against the floorboards as if to say, counted and present. He poured coffee, strong enough to float a horseshoe, and stood at the back door until the cool blue faded from the mesquite. When the light turned the color of clean bone, he stepped out with a coil of wire over one shoulder and a tool bag in the other hand, and he walked his fence. The ranch had never been much to look at. One story. Tin roof. A line of 3 cottonwoods that had somehow found enough water to lift a green flag against the sky each spring. The barn was smaller than the stories told about it. From certain angles, it looked like the hat of a man who'd never quite fit his own head. But the land mattered more than the buildings. Land could make a man honest, or it could measure his dishonesty in furrows so straight the lie hurt to look at. He had come out here because the desert gave a man no place to hide from himself. The dog trotted ahead and waited at each break in the fence, ears pricked. She had learned his habits. He had learned hers. At the second corner post he found fresh scuffs in the hardpan and the shallow crescent of a tire that wore its edges sharp. He didn't trace it too far. He didn't have to. Tracks multiply in soft ground, but on hard country they stand up like a confession. He filed the sight picture in memory with everything else from the past months. The unusual drone of tires at night on the County 2 lane, the short bursts of headlights cutting across the ranch road toward the back ridge, a cluster of burned matches, found near the arroyo where the wind wouldn't spread a flame. He had been listening even longer than he had been watching. A new checkpoint on the interstate had shifted traffic. That was how it starts in places like this. You move the river and men who depend on it carve a new channel overnight. It wasn't politics to him. It was geometry and time. He could measure both. The wire was loose in 3 places. He tightened 2 and left the third so a rabbit could slip through. That had been the deal he made with the wild when he first fenced the property. 1 gap for the creatures that ate the snakes that kept down the mice that chewed the sacks that held the seed. Pretend that a man would make a perfect circle out here and the land would teach him humility with a dust devil that plucked his hat off his head and planted it 50 yards away on a cholla spine. He finished the loop by 9. By 10, the sun had warmed the boards above the rifle racks in the shadowed closet, and the familiar oil-sweet smell there steadied something in him the way a hymn steadies an old church. He cleaned because cleaning was a conversation he understood, a dialogue between patience and attention that ended with the promise the next shot would go where it belonged. The dog slept in the doorway. The radio on the shelf above the workbench stayed silent. He kept it that way unless the weather turned, or unless the county dispatcher's voice rose half a tone, which was how she sounded when there were more calls than units to send. At noon, a dust cloud pinned itself to the road beyond the mailbox and stayed there. Vehicles. More than one because the column was too full, the edges of the plume too torn. He watched from the shade of the porch until the outlines hardened into bodies and chrome. 2 pickups, black, high suspension, slow enough to claim the road. The lead truck stopped in front of his gate and idled. No one got out. He put the dog inside and latched the screen, then walked the length of the porch without hurrying, the way a man walks when he knows he's being studied for signs of weakness. They didn't open with the usual choreography. No one called him Sir. No one pretended to admire the horse out in the back pasture or the neat line of tools hung under the eaves. They didn't bother with the friendly that comes before the threat. 3 men in the lead truck, 2 in the second. One kept his sunglasses on, though they were in deep shade beneath the brim of his hat. The one who spoke had a face like a dry riverbed, creases straight to the bone. "You're on the line," the speaker said. He had a voice built to carry in bars and inside the doorways of women who were paid to pretend. "We're moving cargo east. We like your road." "You like it," he said, "because nobody can see it from the highway." The speaker smiled as if the remark proved a point he had been trying to make to someone else for a long time. "We're going to use it from time to time. Nothing breaks. Nobody hurts your animals. We leave the fence standing and the gate closed behind us." "It's not a public road," he said. "That's why we like it." The desert was quiet enough to hear the belt squeal under the hood of the second truck. 40, maybe 50 feet between the men and the porch steps. The speaker had not looked over his shoulder yet. The sunglasses had not moved. The man in the second truck kept his hands folded where the driver could see them. It would have been funny if it weren't so simple. Men who wanted to rearrange the map needed you to think they could see around corners. They could not. Nobody can. You put yourself where you must to see what you need to see, and even then the world keeps its secrets. "You should talk to the county," he said. "They get itchy when strangers start new routes." "We already talked," the speaker said. He let the man hear the silence that followed. Then he nodded once. "I see." "We're respectful," the speaker said, as if making an official declaration. "We prefer it that way. We like neighbors who mind their own and stay happy. But there's a clause, old man. If you don't like the arrangement, if you think you can go another way, we'll move you off this patch and put someone here who enjoys new company." The dog breathed once on the other side of the screen and went quiet. That half-growl dogs make when the air itself feels wrong. The first fly of the summer drifted between them and changed its mind about landing on the speaker's cheek, confused by the light. He kept his hands at his sides. "You'll use the county road," he said. "You'll use someone else's fence. You'll ask permission the polite way and accept the answer, whichever it is." "You'll accept the reality," the speaker said. He turned to go and paused with one boot heel on the running board. "Next time we come through, we'll open the gate without asking. Close it for us after, if you like." They dusted his porch steps when they pulled out, which was sloppy, and he made a note. Men who dusted you on purpose were telling you something about their training, or about their lack of it. In town, the diner held the same 4 retirees who rearranged the world each morning with their coffee spoons. He didn't go to the diner. Too many mirrors, too many opinions. But he stopped at the feed store and said hello to the woman who kept the books. She looked up at him with the face people have when they want to ask questions they can't frame without breaking something inside themselves. "You seen more traffic than you like?" she asked instead. "Enough," he said. She pursed her lips and tilted her head, a code of sympathy anybody who had spent time west of the Pecos could read. "Well," she said, "if you need help lifting sacks, you knock next door." The offer was a fig leaf, a way to say we all see what's happening and we can't stop it. He took the sacks himself anyway, because the back and the knees still listened to him when he asked nicely. He tried the county after that, dispatch polite, an undercurrent in the voice, the kind of caution that says the mic is shared, the air not your own. She said a deputy would swing by in the late afternoon. A deputy did, but not the one who liked to talk about fishing and who once helped coax the neighbor's heifer out of a cattle guard with 3 ratchet straps and a prayer. This one was new to the district. Boots without scuffs, a uniform shirt crisp enough to suggest a fresh dryer, not sun-dried on a line. He wore his duty belt in the way of men who measure themselves by weight and steel. The deputy stood at the gate and let the engine idle. He seemed reluctant to make his feet dirty with the honest act of stepping out onto another man's soil. He told him not to be a hero and not to get himself into trouble. He didn't say the words any rancher wants to hear from a peace officer. "I will make a report. I will drive the line. I will speak to the neighbors. I will be seen in the places where I need to be seen so that the sun itself can testify someone in uniform still cares." When the deputy left, he did it without looking back, and the dust lifted from the roadbed like a soft accusation. Men, like the ones who had come to the porch, don't knock just once. They knock in patterns. He went through his patterns, too. The routine had the calm of liturgy. Check the water in the galvanized trough. Oil the hinges, not too much because a door that opens silent can be an insult in a house grown used to honest squeak. Walk the property, but in a different order than yesterday. Sit with the dog at the edge of the back wash and let the air write its letters on the tongue. Upwind scent of burned oil, faint and old. Below that, the green smear of mesquite leaf. Below that, the ground itself, which always smells like the truth. In the closet, he ran his hands over wood and steel. He didn't carry what the movies like to show old men carrying, the blued museum pieces pulled out for nostalgia and quickly put away. Tools are tools. You keep them ready, or you sell them to someone who will. But he also knew the danger of romantic accuracy, the trap of thinking that whatever worked in the past would work again if you just cleaned it enough. He had learned this long ago, in rain and jungle and dust and ranges named for saints, and then later in other places his government asked him to deny. Success ages fast, craft does not. The rifle he took to the porch that evening was older than any man on the road who had called him old. It had been kept in good company. The barrel knew how to whisper back when the wind spoke across the feed yard. The optics were nothing special to look at. The glass clear the way a mountain stream is clear if you've spent enough time thirsty. He had maps of his own making, sketches on yellow paper thumbtacked behind the kitchen door, curves of elevation, notations of distances to landmarks the eye takes for granted until it must work for a living, the corner of a tank, the odd post with the twisted grain, the bleached skull half buried near the arroyo bend that caught a small shadow every day at 4:30 in winter. Evening came, and with it the easy choir of insects and the softer exhalations of heat from the tin roof. On the far ridge, a shadow that should have been a rock took a breath. He saw it with the quiet part of his head, the place that had learned to notice when background turns to foreground. When you stare long enough at anything, it either becomes part of you or it reveals its other name. He studied the ridge for a count of 50. At 28, the shadow blinked. He set the stock against his shoulder for the luxury of a look. There are distances that do not impress other men because numbers carry no taste. 100 yards means a football field to somebody who has never had to thread an answer through wind toward a living question. 400 across desert air at dusk feels closer than it is because the light contracts the world like a fist. 800, and you can't be sure anymore what is heat and what is flesh. You rely on rhythm instead, on the small betrayals of movement that no mirage can imitate. He measured his ridge with an instinct that had made him friends he would never meet, and enemies who didn't know who to hate as they fell. The first shot did not land. That is a misunderstanding practiced by the new and the loud. The first shot announces. It teaches distance the name you will be using for the rest of the conversation. It tunes the throat. He put it a foot to the right of the rock that had learned to breathe. It hit a shale chip beyond with the brittle little clatter it makes when an old rock dies of surprise. The shadow settled deeper, as if the earth, embarrassed at its own unsteadiness, meant to pretend it had never faltered. He waited, because waiting is the fastest thing a man can do if he wants to keep his life. The second shape appeared to the left of the first, low, patient, a shape taught by somebody who had himself been taught. He gave that one a warning, too, a whisper at the heel of a boot that had thought itself safe. Then he said it plain, in the only language men like that bothered to learn. The third shot lifted a puff of red dust off the hood of the lead truck just enough to be unmistakable to the man behind the wheel, innocent enough not to be a crime. Engines turned over. Doors didn't slam. Someone in the ravine said one short word in a tone men reserve for their own lungs when they can't get enough air. He let the muted scramble play out to its small conclusion. Footsteps sought the low ground and found it. The shape on the ridge turned into a bush again and stayed that way. He didn't grin. He didn't feel triumphant. There's a lie that creeps into a man's head when he wins a small thing against a large. The lie that this is how the story will go from now on. Stories don't know who's in them. They know only their own appetite. If you want to live long in a bad story, you throw it scraps early and hope it fattens on something else. The next day brought the deputy again. Different hour. Late afternoon when the light is a mirror and men rub their eyes and make easy mistakes. The deputy stood with his thumbs in his duty belt and gestured with his chin toward the far ridge. "Been hearing folks pop off gophers," he said. "Reckon you've seen anything?" "Just the wind," he said. "Wind sounds a lot like .308 from where I'm parked." "Depends which way you're facing," he said. The deputy shifted, as if a small rock had found his boot heel and meant to live there forever. "You keep it quiet," he said. "That's the word from town. No need to stir up what's going to settle on its own." "Is that the word from you?" he asked. "Or from somebody who signs your timesheet?" The deputy's eyes went glassy for a fraction, the way men's eyes do when they translate a thought into a word they think will keep them safe. "From folks who care about you not getting hurt," he said. "Everyone cares," he said, "just not all in the same direction." The deputy left without writing anything down. The notebook stayed pocketed. That is how you learn what a notebook is for. He prepared the way you send a board, with patience and in one direction. He didn't build a barricade because barricades make promises you can't keep unless you mean to die behind them. He didn't lay out elaborate traps because the desert dislikes men who arrange it like furniture. He walked his own loops until the prints of his boots became the kind of story no one bothers to read anymore. He listened for new grammar in the night. Rubber on gravel that hadn't learned the rhythm of locals yet, radios with a half-second squelch at the end that meant someone had learned technology but not etiquette, a laugh that clipped short because permission had not been granted to enjoy anything. He made calls to numbers that weren't in any phone book. Not to brag, not to seek rescue, but to say, in the old working man's way, that a situation existed. The men on the other end said little. They didn't need to. There are people who will always answer your call, not because they love you, but because what you did once makes them who they tell their children they are. He wasn't asking them to come. He was asking the world to be witnessed if it went wrong. On the third night after the first visit, he took his coffee onto the porch and sat where the shadow of the roof cut a rectangle out of the moonlight. The dog settled with her chin between her paws and watched the dark with the patience of an old nun. The world smelled of iron and creosote and the faint sweetness that comes when night animals thread their hunger through the brush. Somewhere far off, a generator coughed and found its breath. He knew where the generator was, he knew how long it took to prime and how the pitch shifted when a man with a heavy hand on the choke got impatient. He knew because he had paid attention on nights when nothing else demanded it. That is how you learn what matters. They came at dusk again, but from the south this time, favoring the low cuts along the wash where a truck can slide in without showing itself against the horizon. He heard them before he saw any sign. Men make a kind of weather around themselves. You can sense the pressure drop the way a cow senses lightning 90 miles away and bunches in a fence corner like a bad decision. The dog rose, didn't bark, looked to him for the command she understood, one finger to the ground, and lay back down, ears trimmed forward. The gate latch clicked in the careful way of men who can't help making even their stealth proud. He let them have the yard. He let them smell the dust of his steps on the path to the barn. One man shone a small light toward the coop, more curious than cruel. Another hung back near the cottonwoods and watched the house the way a man watches a woman on a street he knows she shouldn't be walking alone. He didn't fire. You don't fire at shadows. You invite into your yard to tell you the shape of what's to come. He simply breathed with the rifle in his lap and counted heartbeats into the trigger finger to keep it honest. When the man near the cottonwoods lifted his chin to say something into his collar, and what a blessing it is when the enemy wears his own antenna, he put a shot into the trunk above the man's left ear. A 5-inch slit of bark spit out into the night like confetti, and the man flinched into a crouch and put his back to a problem he could not name. The second man, the one near the coop, startled and raised his light right into his own face, and the light told on him as surely as a child under a mother's question. The shot he sent there was lower, harmless to anything but the courage it hit, square in the middle. The third shot reached out to touch the rear tire of the lead truck, the soft thump of the impact a sentence with a period that politely prevented a future clause. They went quiet, and in the quiet he could hear them take inventory. Hands, feet, vases, because fear sends a man hunting for himself to be sure he is still all his own. Then the chatter started, choked and overlapping. He heard the word viejo once, and he smiled in the dark because men who sized you as old still had measurements to learn. The trucks idled, Someone killed an engine, cursed softly as if the engine had cursed first. They made decisions with that hasty politeness that signals the first bloom of panic. And then they left, not in a rush so much as in a hurry to pretend they had never been there. After, the quiet felt incorrect, like a sentence ended with the wrong punctuation. He sat until the coffee went cold, then made a slow circle around the yard. He didn't announce himself. The dog stayed inside. He found the bark in the starlight. It would be something to keep later, a ribbon to tie around a memory to make it easy to find again. He knelt in the place where the man had raised his light and saw the print of a boot with an odd heel wear, the left heavier than the right. He measured the distance from the cottonwood to the coop. No surprises. The land had behaved. In the morning, the deputy did not come. In the afternoon, a brown sedan he did not recognize took the road to the mailbox and idled there too long. He let it be. Not every dark bird portends a storm. Some simply migrate foolishly late. He repaired the nicked bark with the same care he gave to an old saddle that had learned his weight, binding the ragged edge gently to discourage insects. The cottonwood would heal itself. He wasn't pretending otherwise. He was honoring the courtesy it had shown him by not falling on his head in the night. 2 days later, the men returned, and this time they performed courtesy. They parked out on the road and walked in, 3 abreast, hands visible, the outer 2 glancing just enough toward the middle to show who carried the crown. The speaker had changed. Younger, and with that easy grin you see on men who were recruited at pool tables when they were 19 because someone saw how their shoulders and lies filled a room. He asked after the water. He admired the dog. He admired the view as if he had not measured it already with the cold eye of a man who thought in angles. "You can work with us," he said. "Men out here make little. We make a lot. We could leave envelopes where you say, enough to help with feed, vet, fence posts, enough to make what's happening feel like a benefit." "What's happening feels like a trespass," he said. "Words," the young man said, and let the syllable hang there like a curtain he could pull aside whenever he wanted to reveal whatever scene suited him. "Let's call it change." "Change visits a man," he said, "but it doesn't get to use his kitchen without asking." The grin softened. The eyes stayed hard. "We're coming through," he said. "Don't make it noisy. Noise brings too much family to a small funeral." He let the sentence pass like a wind that doesn't drop rain. "I have called the county," he said. "I'll keep calling." "Call the sky if you want," the man said. "It listens just as much." They went, leaving courtesy behind like a napkin on a table nobody meant to bus. He washed the coffee mug with a slowness that made the dog tilt her head at him, questioning. Then he cleaned a rifle that didn't need cleaning. Then he sat on the edge of his bed and made himself remember names, one by one. The men who taught him how to say wind in numbers, how to smell the difference between his own fear and someone else's. He said the names inside his skull without sound, because sound cheapens things that deserve prayer. There are thresholds in any story, actual doorways you cross without knowing until you can't go back to the room you left. The sun fell. The iron in the stove ticked as it cooled. At the edge of hearing, a drone announced itself. Not a toy, not a military craft, just the kind bought with cash when a man has more of it than sense. He stepped into the kitchen and switched off the lamp. The drone hovered long enough to be certain of its map and then slid south, toward the wash and the low cut in the ridge that any truck would take if it wanted to cross unobserved. He watched it with the same unblinking attention he gave a scorpion in the corner of the porch when he was barefoot. He didn't swat it. He noted its path, its appetite, and the hour it fed. That night he did not sleep all at once. He slept in stacked pieces, 30 minutes each, the way men do when the past returns and the future stands outside like a stranger who hasn't decided whether to knock. The wind shifted at 2 and brought him the faint sour of unwashed wool from the direction of the county road. At 3:30 his dog's ears lifted in a new angle, the listening angle that points not at sound, but at silence where sound should be. He got up and stood near the window until the black softened to graphite. He had prepped nothing dramatic. He had moved nothing heavy. He had not rolled barrels into positions they didn't belong because he didn't want to live in a museum of his own fear. But he had done small things. He had walked the barn aisle in the dark enough times to know every board by sound. He had left an empty bucket where it would ring if a foot found it. He had brushed a line halfway down the path from the gate with a dry mesquite branch until the dust recorded even moths. He had done, in other words, what men do when they believe in their own attention more than in the tools sold to them by people who claim to know the future. They didn't come at the gate. They lifted the back fence where the soil bowed between posts and slid under like boys trespassing an orchard. He admired, grudgingly, the control with which they handled their weight. Whoever taught them had taught that much well. He heard the soft thwip of the fence wire settling against a gloved palm, and he heard the breath of a man who didn't want to exhale in a way the night could count. He let the first one reach the well cover. There's always something about water that draws men to it, the way a candle draws a moth. The second man drifted right to where the barn shadow cut a fat rectangle out of the moonlight. The third man, left-handed by the way his steps lined up, halted near the pile of old posts he meant to rescue into usefulness someday. He could feel their attention. 3 points on a triangle turning to find a center that would tell them where the danger lived. He broke the triangle with one sound. A flashlight beam snapped on from the pasture. His, set on a low post, on an old spring clamp he'd used for a fence fix, angled so the glass wasn't visible from the yard until it was too late. The beam washed white across the far fence like a small daylight, and every head turned toward it because the body loves light even when the mind should know better. He watched them look. He watched where they pointed their chins. He filed it away. Then he put a round into the soil 2 yards in front of the beam, hard enough to throw pebbles into the perpendicular air so a man's shin would feel the sting he would later call incoming, when he wrote his own new story about himself for friends who hadn't been there. "Back to the road," he said, not shouting, because quiet men make more convincing promises. "Go on. You're leaving on your feet tonight." The second man, the one near the barn, tried bravado with his silence. He planted and made a line straight toward the porch. Deliberate, 6 measured steps, then veered behind the cottonwood, as if his plan all along had been to use the tree for cover. The cottonwood said nothing about the bark still missing from its trunk. The first man, near the well, obeyed whatever good ghost still lived in him and stepped back under the fence he had lifted. The third man hesitated, caught between men and orders. He raised some device the size of a paperback to his face and then thought better of it. "Now," he said, "I won't talk again." The second shot found the top rung of the gate latch and broke it in a sound like a cheap cymbal. Metal flinched louder than men. That did it. They went, not smoothly, but fast, which is sometimes better if you intend to live. He stood there while the engines found their throttle on the county road and pulled away, and he let the night pour back into the spaces the men had made with their presence. The dog came to his leg and leaned like a friend who knows he cannot say the right thing but wants his weight to be helpful. By morning, the desert acted as if none of it had happened. The quail gossip started up along the wash, and a red-tailed hawk tacked sidewind against the sun as if to say, "Watch my math." He brewed his coffee and cut 2 slices from the heel of yesterday's bread. He ate standing by the sink and did not watch his own face in the 4-inch square of flawed mirror above the faucet. He didn't need a face to tell him who he was. The brown sedan returned just before noon, this time with 2 men in it, and parked at the mailbox like an idea too unsure of itself to come to the house. He gave them 15 minutes to decide whether they were brave or foolish, and then walked the length of the drive as if every step were being graded by a man who graded steps for a living. The men were not from around here. Their suits fit them like suits, not like borrowed Sunday clothes. They looked at the horizon as if it should be closer. They did not introduce themselves by agency, and he didn't ask. They asked what he had seen, and he told them the truth, which is a flexible instrument if you know how to tune it. They nodded in the clearest language in the West, economy. They said they were listening. They said the county had its hands full. They said more people were moving more stuff on back roads than back roads were meant to carry. They said they would be in touch, which a man can interpret however he likes, depending on how much room he has left in his life for disappointment. He let them go without offering water. He wasn't unkind. He was just careful with invitations. At dusk, the sky stained itself into dark, and the ridge became a single patient animal again. He thought of all the places men had told him he would die, and how none of those places had owned him. He thought of the men who loved him, and the men who hated him, and the odd, quiet fact that both kinds had given him reasons to wake up. He thought, finally, of the one rule he had carved deeper than all the others, the one he brought home when the army had finally agreed he could leave. If you are forced to a line, make it the line you draw yourself. They came once more, not to talk. He felt them before he heard them. That pressure drop again, that shift in the self the body makes when other bodies step into your weather. He didn't wait on the porch this time. He walked to the barn and set a lantern on the sill, and he lit it because it is a mark of respect to give men one clear thing to focus on before you take all the others away. He stood in the barn door as if he were contemplating the old plow blade leaning there. He listened for kindness in his own chest and found it had not deserted him. The first man climbed the fence, slow and showy, as if to prove the fence didn't mean much. The second slid under like a thought you don't want to keep. The third stood at the gate and whispered something to the fourth, who stayed outside, the engine idling a heartbeat he could measure by the way the tin letters on his mailbox shivered. They did not see him step away from the lantern. They did not see how the dark took him back with the ease of an old friend. They saw the lantern, and then a black round appeared in the lantern glass where no black had been, and the flame folded into itself and left them to the moon. It wasn't a shot they heard. It was the absence of light cutting a clean circle into their nerve and dropping it into their shoes. The voice he used came from a place he hadn't needed to visit in many years. He let it stand at their backs like shade at noon. "You knock," he said. "You wait to be asked in. You don't touch a man's water. You don't disturb his animals. You don't change his maps. That's how neighbors live long." One of them, young, that reflexive contempt you can smell, raised his own light in answer and threw it right into his own eyes again. He stepped left, allowed himself the one pleasure an old man can claim without shame, that he could still move as quiet as honest hunger. Then he put a round into the dirt directly between the man's feet. Pebbles jumped. The young man made a sound like a child smothering a cry so his father won't wake. "You take this kindness," he said. "There won't be another kindness." They went. Not because they feared him, not yet, but because they had suddenly remembered they belonged to a hierarchy that punished improvisation. Someone above them wanted a clean narrative, and men like this obey narratives as if they're gods. He let them put their own fear back into their pockets like handkerchiefs they would need later to mop their faces. He slept then, more from discipline than fatigue. The body will lay itself down when the mind has given it honest work. In the morning he rose before the sun again and made his coffee. He wrote 3 notes on the yellow pad and sealed them in separate envelopes because sometimes the difference between being alone and being abandoned is simply whether someone in a distant office receives a piece of paper with your name on it, before or after a bad thing happens. He stacked feed. He brushed the horse. He ran his hand along the dog's back and felt the small ridges of old scars where life had reached for her with a rough hand and she had slipped away. He told the land its own weather, as if reciting familiarity could make it more loyal. He stood on the porch and set his feet where the wood had memorized him, and he looked to the ridge and he said, quiet as prayer, "You belong to me until I'm done." By noon he saw the new dust again, 3 plumes this time, not 2, and the line of them wider, careless in their confidence. He did not reach for the rifle in the closet. He set a kettle on the stove instead. He filled the dog's bowl. He checked the back door latch as if the latch were something worth trusting. When the truck stopped at the gate and the men fanned out with the easy air of dancers rehearsing a number they imagine will bring applause. He stepped into the shade of the porch and waited for them to find out what kind of stage they had chosen. The speaker was back to the older one, the dry riverbed face. His smile was new, a learned thing, as if someone had instructed him in manners during the intervening days. "We're done asking," he said. "This is the last courtesy." "Then we agree," he said. "No more courtesy." He could feel the story tilt then, not in his favor or theirs, but toward the slope that would bring them all to the place where decisions are not thoughts anymore, but acts. Somewhere behind the trucks a hawk cried, Or maybe it was a piece of loose tin on somebody's toolbox. The desert held its breath a little as if wanting to know what word would come next. He knew, with a certainty that felt like a cool rag on fevered skin, that from here on out noise would be part of the day's weather. The trucks idled. The flies returned. A far, tiny speck in the sky took a gentle turn and winked along the sun's edge. A drone again, making small loops, eager the way a new pup is eager when it doesn't yet understand the consequences of wagging into a stranger's legs. He took all of it in and set it on the shelf inside him where he kept the useful, and he let the rest fall. "Close your engines," he said, "if you intend to speak like men." They didn't. That was enough answer. He stepped back into the shadow of his doorway and let the first part of the story end, the way a long intake of breath ends before a man speaks his true mind for the first time in years. They tested the edges first, because that is what men do when they want to believe the center will be easy. The next 3 nights had their own weather. Little gusts of sound that rose and fell where the fence met the wash, faint flashes that were more suggestion than light. The drone returned, lazy in its circles, banking along the hot rim of the sky as if it were just a curious bird with a plastic heart. The old man let it map what it wanted to map, because a map that looks complete is the surest way to make a fool of the man who trusts it. He measured the land again, this time as if he had only just arrived and needed to be convinced it would hold him. The arroyo to the west drafted cool air at night and spilled it east at dawn. He felt the tide of it against the bones of his wrist and pinched the pulse there, counting, then penciled a single arrow on the inside of the nearest fence post. He carved shallow marks under the top rail where the cattle wouldn't rub them away. 1 notch for wind holding steady above 5 miles by feel. 2 for wind that wandered. He tied a strip of feed sack string to a nail on the corner of the barn and let it become a tiny banner he could read from the kitchen sink. He wasn't chasing science the way men in lab coats chase it with graphs and graduate assistants. He was making himself a living clock that told only what he needed to know. He made decoys that didn't insult the land. A length of spare hose became the shape of a calf sleeping in a shallow hollow behind the corral, because the human eye will assign meaning to any curve that looks like breath at a glance. A bundle of mesquite cuttings under an old feed tarp looked like a hunched man in the half-light. He placed it against the fence where a wary intruder would love to find a sentry to test. He clipped a kerchief to a post near the back path so that from certain angles, in a low wind, it suggested a man's shoulder turning. He did nothing theatrical. The desert would not permit theater and would mock you with dust if you tried. Sound bait came next, small and mean as a burr. He took the kitchen egg timer, wound it just once, and set it under a rusted bucket out by the well, then walked back inside to listen. The ticking didn't carry, not really, but the bucket made a hollow promise of it, a suggestion that might nag at any man whose nerves were tuned for trouble. He hung a cheap cowbell under the low mesquite that arched the path from the cottonwoods to the barn. The bell was too small to ring on its own. It would only chime if a body brushed branches in a hurry, and then the note would be quick, embarrassed, human. He tuned the yard to sing to him without anyone else knowing there was a song. The dog watched all this with the patient affection of a partner who knows the other can't help the way he is. She learned faster than he did which parts of the new order were hers. When he left an old boot toe out at the threshold to gauge wind through the gap under the door, she left it alone. When he leaned a plank just so against the coop to cast a particular shadow across the yard at sundown, she lay where she could see the shadow and not the plank. If he went out at 1 in the morning to walk a slow loop with a flashlight held low and forward, she kept her pace 2 paces behind his heel so her own shadow wouldn't crowd the one he wanted to read. On the 4th night, the drone dipped lower than it had any right to. He was out by the windmill with a mug the color of the sky before rain when he heard the insect whine, sag for a breath, and then recover. The sound told him more than the picture ever would. Whoever held the controls was learning gravity the hard way, discovering that air is a hand that either holds you or drops you according to rules you can feel but not vote on. He didn't swat it with pellets or try to net it with some fool contraption men on the internet might recommend. He set his mug down, moved into the shadow of the windmill's tower, and let the blades do what they would do anyway. When the drone crossed the plane of the spinning vanes, the stutter in the picture was enough to ruin the flight plan. It wobbled, corrected, climbed, fled. The wind had done the work. He had simply invited the wind to the task. By then, the deputy's pattern had declared itself. Calls he made to the county yielded visits that arrived late and left early. The deputy would stand with his thumbs in his belt and talk about caution and patience and how trouble burns out on its own if you don't feed it. Each visit was followed within a day by men nosing the gate or shadows in the wash or engines idling just beyond the mailbox. Always that same sequence, like clockwork, and always the same interval between. He did not accuse the deputy. That would have been a waste of time and dignity. Instead, he fed him words he wanted overheard. He mentioned, as if in passing, that he was low on feed and would be in town the next day from noon to 2. He said, just loud enough for the cruiser's dash cam to catch the shape of the mouth if anyone ever bothered, that his knee had been acting up and he was sleeping solid between 2 and 4. He let slip an irritant about a replacement lock for the tack room he hadn't installed yet. He cast hooks the way a man with no time for sport casts them. Quick, precise, not caring if he caught anything except the proof of a current. What came back wasn't elegant. Men showed between noon and 2, bold as crows that have figured out the scarecrow is too proud to move. A truck paused beyond the tack room door and then rolled on. A flashlight found the bedroom window at 317 and lingered like a finger pressed to glass. Someone put a gloved hand on the new back door latch he had installed months ago and then withdrew, as if its steadiness offended him. The deputy's cruiser passed the ranch at odd hours without stopping, his silhouette turning once toward the porch like a man who wants to be seen wanting to do something he has no intention of doing. The old man didn't mind the confirmation. Compromise is a kind of math. If you must solve for X, best to pose your own equation. The first real push came on a moonless night that smelled of hot iron and fallowed earth. He knew it was assembled by a different hand as soon as the trucks killed their lights 100 yards too early, as if the driver trusted his memory more than the road. The men didn't bumble. They fanned as if someone had drawn X's and arrows on a napkin and the paper had gone into 4 pockets committed to proving the drawing smart. One took the wash and moved with the posture of someone who had been told to keep his head below the line of the bank, not because he believed in cover, but because he wanted to be seen following orders. 2 moved for the cottonwoods. Always the cottonwoods because trees invite men into a confidence with the same false warmth as a bad church. The last skated along the fence with a crowbar nested against his thigh and his jaw working as if he were chewing on a speech. He had already moved the horses to the far pasture, not because he suspected a fire, not then, but because the animal's fear would echo any mistake he made. He set a kerosene lantern on a half-bale in the barn, far from anything that could catch, and cracked the door so the line of light drew a second door on the yard. Then he went to the kitchen and opened the window above the sink and set the rifle on the sill with a sandbag that had once anchored a tent in the Rockies when men in his life were still alive to make jokes about his tent tying. He let the night come to him. He refused to invite it with the impertinence of a man who thinks he can choreograph a thing that refuses choreography. The first man reached the coop and tripped his own impatience. The small cowbell coughed a single note that sounded like a child apologizing. He put a round into the dirt 14 inches in front of those boots and heard the same pebbles jump up. The same lesson delivered with the same grammar. You are on a sentence that does not end how you want it to. Instead of pulling back, the man turned his light toward the barn. The beam found the cracked door, the lantern within, the hay that looked too close to the glow. He could feel the man's imagination step into the barn before his body did. He didn't shoot the man. He shot the lantern. The glass puckered white, then dark, then the light guttered on itself without throwing flame. The black that followed was so complete it felt like a held breath, and in that breath the men gave themselves away. One swore in a voice that had never learned how to swallow a swear. One called a name as if he could bring his friend back to him by throwing the right syllables at the dark. One snapped the crowbar from his thigh to his hands as if the metal would volunteer an idea. And then, because all plans are drawn by men who don't have to carry them on their backs, somebody tossed a bottle that had a rag in its mouth. The arc was pretty in the way that stupid is sometimes beautiful. Clean parabola, soft landing right where a boy would have wanted his ball to fall in a game played much earlier in a gentler life. The bottle broke against the door and fire shouldered its way up the wood like a proud drunk on a stage. He felt his gut give the small twist it gives when the land is hurt for your sake. He wanted to be angry, and then he wasn't, because anger is another plan drawn by a man who won't be around to see it fail. He let the barn go. He had watered the boards earlier, yes. He had scraped the aisle clean. He had moved the kerosene to a safe shelf. But Flame is a king for a reason. It took what it wanted from the dry edges and made more of itself, crackling in small jokes about the pride of men who think wood should behave. He pulled his sight to the wash instead, and saw the shape he'd marked as the man who followed orders peer over the lip to take inventory of the light. He put a round through the brim of that man's hat without collecting so much as a hair. The hat leapt like a spooked animal, and the man fell back onto his shoulder and rolled down the bank, cursing at gravity for doing what it does to all of us. The others broke formation the way men do when fire is doing arithmetic they didn't account for. One ran across the yard, low, hands to his ears as if sound hurt worse than heat. Another made for the truck and skidded in the dust as if he had arrived at his own childhood and didn't like the company. He could have poured rounds into them until the night was done with their questions. He did not. He wrote brief sentences instead, the kind that end with a period you can hear. A tire hissed flat against a rim. A mirror spat glass into the dirt. A tailgate learned the language of new dents and would speak with a stutter tomorrow. Men who intend to return should not be allowed to return with pride. When the men finally dragged the wash crawler into the back of a truck and limped away, the barn's roof sighed and sagged and then clapped down, sparks leaping like moths at a border they could not cross. He stood with a shovel and did what he could at the edges, where flame turns to greed but hasn't had its dinner yet. He saved what beams were willing to be saved. He let the rest make their orange argument against the sky and lose to the night. He brought the horses their grain in a bucket and didn't apologize for the smell in the air. The animals munched and rolled their eyes once and then decided the world had given them enough reasons to be tired without inventing more. He bled, but not much. A splinter had gone into the meat of his forearm when he lifted a board with the stupidity men call bravery for lack of a better word. He sat at the kitchen table and cleaned the cut with the care he gave a rifle bore, then wrapped it in gauze that had started life as a clean shirt and been demoted for service. The blood's color didn't bother him. The fact of it did. Blood says you are real, which is not what you want to be when men are trying to turn you into a lesson. At first light, he walked what remained. He collected brass in a coffee can, not to count coup, he wasn't a boy, but to read head stamps and note caliber and brand because certain supply lines buy certain lots and certain lots show up in certain hands. He took a stub of carpenter's pencil and wrote a single line under yesterday on the yellow legal pad. Barn gone. Wind knee at 6, veering. Drone clumsy, deputy's clock holds. He wrote small, yet in a hand that looked like a decision. Men forget that writing makes you answerable to your own eyes later. Town woke to the news before the sun had the decency to warm the gravel. Someone's cousin, someone's dispatcher, someone's gentleman in a brown sedan. All of them knew something had burned west of the Cotton Gin, and all of them already guessed whose. He didn't go to the diner. He went to the feed store as usual and nodded to the bookkeeper. She took one look at the ash on his sleeve and made a face like a scream she couldn't afford to let loose. "Wind got you?" she said, as if wind were the only thief allowed to operate in daylight. "Wind got hungry," he said. She rang his order without looking at the keys. Numbers can read themselves when the heart is busy. On the way out, he crossed paths with the deputy's cruiser idling by the hardware. The deputy lifted 2 fingers off the wheel in a salute that meant less than it looked like it meant. The old man paused long enough that the deputy had to decide whether to roll forward or roll down the window. He chose the window. "Shame about your outbuilding," the deputy said, choosing a word that tried to sound precise and ended up sounding like he had swallowed a manual. "Barn," the old man said. "You can say barn." It was a barn. It held feed and memories. Both burn. "Oh, you got the report to make?" "I've got a fire to rake and 2 horses to reassure. Reports can wait till the wind loses interest in who I am." The deputy made a show of flipping open his notebook then, finally, as if lifting its cover signaled virtue. He wrote nothing. He looked at the lines already there and pretended one more had appeared. "County'll do what we can," he said, and even he sounded ashamed of the sentence as it left his mouth. Back at the ranch, the ruin looked clean the way catastrophe sometimes looks clean after it has made its point. The blackened ribs of the roof lay like a fish's bones on the stone. The smell would take weeks to admit defeat. He moved the salvageable lumber into a pile that had the dignity of hope. He found a horseshoe under a fallen plank, its curve charred and pretty, and set it on the windowsill without superstition. The dog trotted the perimeter and peed on each new char, as if to claim it, yes, but also to bless it back into the living world. The men adjusted their approach after that, because even cowards learn when fire speaks. They kept distance, tested with scouts, put feelers where the wash bent in the way an arroyo does when it's old enough to remember a different map. They sent a pair by day once, leaning into normal like actors rehearsing an easy lie. He watched them gather trash from the roadside and put it in a sack as if they were doing anyone a favor. Their boots were too new to be believable. Their hands were too empty. He took a picture of them with his mind and filed it behind the barn fire in a folder labeled Lessons Taught by Smoke. They tried noise. ATVs in the early evening. The ugly two-stroke cough of them bouncing off the basalt seam like boys unable to resist their own echoes. They meant to wear him out, rattle him out of detail work, make him sloppy. He lubricated the hinges on the kitchen cabinets until they gave no answer at all to his hand, then left one deliberately unoiled so a squeak told him exactly when his attention had wandered. He drank water on a schedule and ate when the dog ate and slept an hour at a time with a pencil between his fingers so a line drawn on his own pad would tell him when he had drifted, and for how long. He disciplined himself into a rhythm so calm it made the racket look foolish. 2 nights after the barn burned, the drone came with a companion. Smaller, quicker, the zipping whine of it higher than a mosquito but just as irritating. He didn't bother the windmill this time. He had draped 2 strips of shiny mylar, cut from an emergency blanket, inside the branches of the cottonwood so they hung slack unless the air wanted them. When the small drone slid between trunk and limb, the mylar caught the wash of its own propellers and fluttered once in a way that sent the camera into a hunt for exposure the sky couldn't control. The video would be a blackout with a sharp silver signature and nothing else. The men learned something and didn't know what they had learned. That is the worst teacher, and he wanted them to have it. He kept his own records as if he'd be called to testify to himself before a stern judge he respected. He sketched faces. Not good art, just percentages and angles, the slope of a nose, the set of a mouth under stress. He wrote down words he heard, the code switching between Spanish and English and a separate dialect made of greed and boredom. He pulled brass from the dirt and wiped it with an oil rag and noted head stamps and dings. He read the way they ran when they ran, whether they favored old injuries, whether boots clipped left toward a man who had been taught to lead with his dominant side. He wasn't looking for trophies. He was assembling a soft map of men who believed maps only showed roads. The bleeding came for him proper on a Sunday morning when the sun had the nerve to be beautiful. He had gone to the far fence to reset a staple that had pulled out in the night, and a shot whispered in from somewhere out past the basalt seam and nicked the meat high on his shoulder as if to borrow a small part of him for later. He dropped to a knee without asking his knee's permission and rolled behind a clump of prickly pear that offered all the cover a man needs if he has learned to be small. He didn't shoot back. He counted. He let the wind write the arithmetic on his cheek and noted the way the second shot arrived a beat too late, the shooter correcting what he didn't understand. Whoever it was had watched a video once and believed the video would take the test for him. He belly-crawled a soft half-moon and vanished into the wash, then hiked home the long way, cursing himself only for the sloppiness of trusting routine in a week that refused to be routine. He cleaned the wound with the same coffee he'd meant to drink. It is not medicine, but it is not dirty, and taped a pad across it and tied the knot with his teeth when his left hand got stubborn. He did not call anyone. He did not brag to himself about the quiet of it. He let the lesson settle in his bones where lessons belong. You can be good and still be given a reminder by a man who doesn't deserve to teach you anything. That afternoon, the deputy returned with flowers from his aunt's yard in a jelly jar, as if that bought him a vote. He made noises about the fire, about how fast wood goes when the sap rides it, about how sorry the county was for the loss. The old man stood in the shade and let the deputy run out of weather. When there was nowhere for the deputy's words to go, he added his own. "I'll be away tomorrow between noon and 2, he said, and watched the deputy try not to flinch at how neatly the sentence fit into the week's arithmetic. "Good time to rest," the deputy said. "A good time to be seen in town." "Good time to be seen," he agreed. He didn't go anywhere the next day. He parked the truck under the cottonwoods where the shade would lie about the temperature under the hood. He set the kitchen timer and listened to it across the room. He slipped out before noon and lay prone along the basalt seam with a pair of binoculars so old their rubber smelled like a childhood he hadn't been given. At 12:47, a single truck nosed up to the gate and idled, then rolled forward without asking, believing the lie the deputy had bought with his jelly jar. He watched 2 men step out and admire their own idea of boldness. One pointed at the truck in the shade and said a word that meant empty. The other laughed. He let them count coup on his porch. One small scratch in the paint with a key, big victory for a small mind, and then he ruined their tires from 800 yards as they drove away. They jounced along to the county road on their rims, throwing sparks like a parade. If they felt chased by a ghost, so much the better. A man who starts to name the wind your partner has begun to lose to a thing he can't fight. They tried a scout on foot that evening, a lean shape moving with the patience of a hunter who had been told stories about patience by a good grandfather. The old man admired the line of him, admired the way he kept to shade, the way he stopped when the quail stopped, as if he could hear with them. He let that one come close enough to smell the sun on his shirt, then took a stick and pushed it against a strip of tin roofing he'd propped behind the coop. The metal made the softest scrape, barely more than the ghost of a sound, and the scout froze as if the earth had told him that motion had been outlawed. The old man waited until the frozen turned to tremble, then let the tremble turn to retreat without penalty. Not every lesson has to be graded with pain. 2 days later, they chose morning, as if sunlight would make the work cleaner. He saw the commander for the first time then, not by rank insignia. Criminals don't wear that sort of jewelry, but by the easy way space made a seat for him when he stepped into a group. He was the kind of man who has practiced standing in the center so long he can do it without looking at his feet. 35, maybe younger. Face like a coin somebody had worried in a pocket for a year. His men turned their chins toward him as if their necks had learned the angle same time their loyalty did. He eyed the burnt barn not with sorrow or pride but with hunger for the story it could tell about him if he found the right words to hang on it. He didn't touch the gate. He didn't look at the house. He looked at the horizon, and in that small blasphemy he told the old man everything he needed to know. The commander's plan made a kind of sense men find compelling when they read it at a table. Soft probe at dawn. 2 men talking too loudly about gas and weather just within earshot, then a hold, then a fast roll of 3 trucks at the minute when the old man would be feeding the horses, then a foot team cutting the wire at the back and flowing in as if they were made of water. It would have worked on a man who trusted routines more than wind. It would have worked if the old man hadn't been teaching himself for a week to admire wind more than plans. He moved the feed time. He left a scoop out on the fence post to make someone think otherwise. He placed a mirror on the ground near the coop so that the sun would blind anyone trying to look toward the house from that angle. He opened the tack room and set the timing of his own steps so the sound of the scoop in the bin sounded like the scoop in the bin, just not when a clock told the story. The trucks came on schedule, because men who love schedules love them in the way the lonely love a promise. He let the first 2 get in the yard where turning around would cost them time. He kept the third outside the gate by making the latch break again, one clean shot, and sent the driver out to solve a puzzle he didn't know was beneath his hands. The foot team slithered under the back fence and reached the water trough the way water does. Eager, certain, proud. He cracked a single round over the trough that blew a sliver of galvanized lip into the air, and every head ducked for pressure instead of cover. Then he moved left and let silence say what it says best, that you do not know what you think you know. The commander didn't panic. He tried to call, and the call didn't go. Not jammed, he wasn't that far along in his plans yet, but confused by the land, which had learned to bounce signal differently since the barn changed the way heat rose. The commander made the decision good commanders make when information goes missing. He pulled his men back without punishing them for being alive. The trucks backed out in a procession tight enough to satisfy a parade marshal, and the last one clipped to the mailbox, and the old man let the letters scatter across the road as if the week had given him permission to believe in metaphor. He slept, finally, a deep, honest sleep for 3 hours with his forearm on a bag of frozen peas and his shoulder deciding to forgive the .22 of a splinter he had missed. He dreamed nothing, which is the best dream a man can ask for when men are trying to smuggle their imaginations into his yard. When he woke, he listened to the weather radio because he trusted it on the days when it had no reason to lie. A front had formed west, pushed by a low that had chewed itself stupid over the desert for a week and now wanted to travel. "Wind," the voice said, in the even tone of a priest reading a band's list, gusts into the 30s overnight, steady 2 days, dust. Visibility down, engines complaining, men making mistakes. He wrote 2 words on the yellow pad. Wind window. He underlined them once, slowly, because underlining is a promise to yourself that you intend to keep a thing in mind even if the world later tries to pry it loose. The next day, he tested the storm's first exhale with ribbon and ash. He pinched a little dust from the edge of the drive between finger and thumb and let it fall, watching what the air did with the powder. He tied a new feed sack string under the eave and read its angle at the hour when the trucks had rolled last time, and again an hour earlier, and again an hour later. He walked long, oblique lines across the yard to learn where his own footprints would vanish first. He listened to the distant county road until the passing cars became tone rather than events, a steady, not quite note he could hum if asked. The deputy called that evening instead of coming, which was bold, because men who sell you out prefer to sell you out in person, where their good teeth can do some of the work for them. The old man let the phone ring out twice, then lifted. "You all right out there?" the deputy asked, pushing concern down the line like a man pushing a wheelbarrow uphill. "Better than my barn," he said. "County's stretched thin," the deputy said. "We got word there might be visitors. Again. Maybe think about staying with a friend in town for a night or 2. "Forecast says wind," he said. "Hard to keep a hat on in town when wind gets a mind. You don't want to be out there if it kicks up. No sense being stubborn and alone." He thanked the deputy for the neighborly warning. He did not ask who had asked the deputy to deliver it. He left the phone on the table with the line still open until the deputy made the impatient sound men make when they discover you're not going to help them pretend the call is about anything but what it is. Then he hung up and wrote the hour down in his careful hand. If a man warns you away from your own porch the night before a windstorm, he isn't worried about your hat. He wants your door to open to his hand without you being there to suggest another use for it. They came earlier than usual the following evening, as if a foreman had tried to outrun the weather and earn himself a commendation from a man whose commendations only ever buy trouble. Engines fussed against dust. Lights found their own reflection too soon and had to be killed, a humiliation that sours men who like to look splendid in their own mirrors. He felt the storm's first push lean on the eaves. The wind bent the cottonwoods into a long, collective bow. Sand hissed against tin. It was a good sound if you loved the place. It was a scary one if you thought the place owed you favors. He had rewritten the yard for wind, not in big moves but in leaners and angles. The plank he had used to throw shadow now threw wind. He set it so that air knifed around it and made a slow back eddy that would catch a body moving fast and turn it half a step toward the left. A coil of rope hung where rope had no business. Anyone brushing it would leave it swaying just enough to sing a tiny tune only he would notice from the kitchen. He lifted the hood of the truck under the cottonwoods, not to pretend he was helpless but to give the wind a thing to play with. The hood bounced once a minute in a rhythm that would make a careless man think someone was moving behind it. They advanced anyway, because plans, once built, hate to be alone. The commander kept out of the yard for now, letting his lieutenants test it for him. One of those men carried a little black radio, the kind every catalog pretends is secure. The old man heard the half-second squelch at the end of each press, that lazy tail of a sound that told him the operator liked the way his thumb felt on the talk button more than he liked silence. He listened for the pattern and found it. Double press when scared, single press when proud. When the double press started to multiply like mice, he moved into the wind corridor he had arranged between the house and the coop and let the air do what air does to sound. The men's calls blurred. The wind rearranged their vowels. He wasn't jamming them, he was letting the land edit their sentences. A shape came fast along the fence, hunched into speed, head down against sand. He could have dropped him. He did not. He put a shot past the man's left ear, so close the wind of the bullets passing scolded him. The shape stumbled into the fence at the point where he had left a loop of loose wire, and the wire snagged a sleeve and held it not cruelly, but with the indifferent strength of metal doing what it was drawn to do. The man cursed and tried to pull, and the more he pulled, the deeper the barb on the old staple made its argument. The old man could have walked out and considered the moment face to face. He did not. He let the wind and the fence teach. After a minute, one of the others came and cut the sleeve free with a small knife, and they went on, less sure, more angry, and therefore closer to the kind of mistake the weather loves. The yard was a training range now, but he was not training them. He was training himself to read them as if they were weather too. They favored the cottonwoods because trees tell men from cities that this is where you belong. They approached the well as if thirst were a story they admired and wanted to inhabit. They used the wash as if their bodies were water, forgetting that water always leaves tracks where it slows. If you know what a thing loves, you can walk 2 steps ahead of it without running. They made their push under the worst of the gusts, 3 at once, as if they had finally convinced themselves that noise makes math easier. 1 for the porch, 1 for the kitchen window, 1 for the back door. He saw all 3 the way a shepherd sees 3 sheep considering the same gap in a fence. He answered back door first with a shot that shaved a splinter into the man's cheek and made him slap a hand to his face in surprise that a house could move. He threaded around through the porch rail between 2 balusters, not to wound but to scare a boot away from the step it coveted. He let the kitchen window man break the pane with his elbow and then flicked off the kitchen light with the toe of his boot so the man's own flashlight owned him. The beam found clean dishes on a towel. It found the cookbook with his late wife's handwriting in the margins. It found a mug with a crack like a river. It did not find a target, because targets don't stand where a fool tells them to stand. The commander began to reveal himself then, not by stepping into view, but by the way his men moved. They withdrew quickly when their pushes met the wind and went limp rather than shatter. They didn't mutiny with chaos. They didn't punish the house by shooting it to pieces. They failed with a kind of grace that suggested the man at the edge valued men more than theater. He hated that. He distrusted men who learned the value of other men. He had built his life on it, and he knew too much about the price to believe anyone could pay it without asking for change. They fell back into their trucks and idled at the gate as if the act of leaving required ceremony. The commander stood with one palm on the fender and watched the house without looking at it directly. His head turned a fraction when the wind flagged and his eyes narrowed, and the old man saw the tiny adjustment a good shooter makes when he's picturing distance in bad air. There it was. The other legend, not told in any bar, not bragged into any girl's ear, but living and quiet. This one knew the weight of bullet and wind at range. This one had the humility to know that precision is a prayer. The old man nodded to the invisible between them and felt something like respect settle into the throat that had spent the week scolding itself for having to raise a voice. They left, and the wind stayed, and the house clicked and flicked as if it were adjusting its bones to new weather. He cleaned glass from the kitchen floor and left the crack in the mug alone because flaws are a record, too. He patched the back door with a board he had salvaged from the barn, and the smell of char punched him once, small and mean and honest. He slept with the radio low, the way a man sleeps after a second long day of harvest, not because he wants to dream about wheat, but because the body likes to know it has done something plain and real. Morning delivered a sky the color of old tin and a sun that couldn't hold its own ground. He walked the yard and picked up the shells they had left because bad housekeeping offends him. He found a glove tangled on the fence where the sleeve had given up and placed it on the fence post as if returning a hat to a peg. He wrote on the pad again, one more line. Commander favors range, stays back, values men. Arrives after deputy plus 180 men. Prefers low moon or dust. Final on wind. He circled the words with the pencil and let the circle close as if it were a corral gate pushed by an easy hand. The numbers worked. The interval between deputy visits and pressure, the hour they chose for pushes, the way the drone scouted at daylight when wind was least cranky, the shift to dust when wind rose and visibility dropped. It all tracked like tracks you could see from a saddle at a trot. He could predict them, not because he was clever, but because men who need the world to be a certain way will always choose the hour that makes the lie easiest to believe. He put his finger to the pad and tapped the time he liked best on the radio's forecast. Late tomorrow, just after the gusts maxed and before the front threw a tantrum of its own, when engines would choke and men would talk too loud to hear themselves. He wrote the hour down. He underlined it, not because he trusted clocks, but because he trusted what the weather does to a man who trusts clocks. He sharpened 2 pencils with a knife that had learned his thumb long ago. He folded 3 maps he did not need, because folding maps is how you teach your hands to remember the size of the place they live. He took the horses far out to the dip where the ridge hides them, and he spoke to them with a voice he hasn't used on men in years. He set the dog's bed under the kitchen table, and the dog sighed like a grandmother who has seen too much and still believes stew will fix a broken day. He cleaned the rifle, not because it was dirty, but because cleaning is a prayer he can say without blasphemy. When the deputy rolled by that afternoon and pretended not to see him, he lifted a hand anyway and made a small circle in the air with his finger, like a man signaling a second verse of a song he intends to sing all the way through. The deputy's brake lights flashed once, a stutter that told the old man the deputy wished for a world in which brake lights meant more than they do. Then the cruiser went on, and dust closed the small parentheses the tires had made in the day. He sat on the porch as the sun thought about leaving and let the wind write the last draft of the plan across his face. He had not declared war. He had not invited it. But the war had come like any weather, full of its own plans, and he had chosen to be the shape the wind met and had to move around. He didn't polish his legend in his head. He didn't let some old parade call up ghosts to march past his eyes. He made tea, because coffee would make the hand lie about how steady it was, and he watched the ribbon on the eave swing through the angle he had come to trust, and he listened for the loose hood on the truck to give its soft thump. And he looked at the yellow pad where a single hour had 2 lines under it, and he felt peace arrive the way a good shot arrives, without drama, without the lie of certainty, just the quiet click of something honest settling into place. When the first grit-laden gust shouldered the porch post, he smiled without teeth. The storm had found him, and the men would have to come through it to find him again. He tested the door latch with 2 fingers and let it catch and release with a small, respectful sound. The house had learned his voice. The land had learned his pace. The hour was set the way a heart sets itself when it has had enough practice keeping people alive. He wrote one last thing on the pad, not for memory, but for manners. Be kind, be quick, be gone. Then he set the pencil down and closed his eyes just long enough to see the range in his head the way it looked when all the men who had taught him were lined up beside him, quiet, ready, citizens of the wind. The wind came in crooked, shouldering against the porch post as if testing it for weakness. Dust unstitched the horizon into tatters and stitched it back again, and the dog leaned into his shin to remind him that some things remain true even when the air forgets itself. He tasted the storm on his tongue, iron and mesquite, and the strange clean of far rain that never reaches the ground. Every hinge on the place sang a small song in its own key. Out beyond the basalt seam, the sky lowered itself until it could hear what the land meant to say. He had underlined a single hour on the yellow pad. The plan wasn't clever. Clever breaks when the wind gets a mind. It was simple and layered, more like prayer than strategy. Invite the weather to choose sides, give the ground a few chances to speak first. Let men's habits do the rest. He set the kettle to hum for the last of the strong tea, checked the dog's water, pressed a palm to the back door until the latch spoke its familiar click and release, and stood where the kitchen light made a clean rectangle on the floor. When the wind shoved the house hard enough that the spoon in the mug rattled, he turned the light off and let the storm own the glass. Engines announced themselves badly. Air, this dirty, eats sound, and then belches it back out wherever it pleases. A man can mishear distance by a canyon if he trusts his ears over his feet. He had met men like the commander, men who believed discipline could bully physics. The trucks came from two angles, one line bleeding along the county road and one parting through the wash that memory and greed had worn into a kind of private driveway. Headlights tried to perform the usual trick: flick on, flick off, flick on, pretend nobody saw, but the dust threw their beams into the truck's own faces like a mirror with a mean streak. He could almost feel the commander frowning at the math of it. He didn't meet force with force. He breathed. The dog settled under the table, her pulse warm against his boot. He let the storm tell him when a truck found first gear without liking it, when two men hissed at each other because a door had slammed instead of easing shut, when radios began to clip words into little panicked cubes that could no longer carry, meaning from one skull to another. Somewhere to the south, a bit of roofing, his or a neighbor's it hardly mattered, flapped, failed, and went. The wind cheered, the house listened. They tried to set 3 hooks at once. One hook took the cottonwoods because a tree calls to men same as a church door. One hook slid along the fence toward the half-buried skull that threw its 4:30 winter shadow even when a man had no business seeing winter in a moment like this. The last hook stopped in the dark bowl near the well to look up and imagine himself safe because he had chosen the right kind of low ground. He could have punished any of them. He didn't. He gave the wind first crack. The loose hood he'd left propped on the truck found its rhythm. Thump, settle, thump, settle. Heartbeat you could mistake for footsteps if you didn't believe in weather. A length of feed sack string under the eave traced a tight angle and then snapped straight, pointing a finger at the kitchen window and then away. He had hung a coil of rope where no rope belonged. The wind tugged it and let it sway, and its braiding whispered against the nail with a sound like breath swallowed and held. The man by the cottonwoods flinched toward the porch because his body thought he had heard a man's lungs lose their nerve. The one by the fence stepped into the wrong wind and bleated a command that blew back into his own ear. The well man raised a gloved hand to shield his light and, in doing so, told the storm exactly where to put the grit. He marked all 3 with the calm arithmetic he had earned instead of been given. A single round low into the sand near the fence to bounce pebbles against his shin and get his attention. A scold past the cottonwood that took bark the way a barber takes hair, neat and clean and insulting only if the customer insists. A stern tap against the well's cast lip that made the water beneath it answer with a hollow thonk. No harm, only lesson. All 3 men dropped. None were hit. The trucks idled, coughing against the dust, and the commander's radio tossed a sentence that tried to be an order and landed as a request. The house replied to that request without being asked. The loose board on the back door, salvaged from the barn, still smelling faintly of bitter smoke, flexed under the wind and made the kind of sound a boot makes when it thinks it's creeping. The man assigned to the kitchen swore he heard someone inside. He lived in the flashlight rather than in his feet. When his beam hit the sink, it found the sandbag on the sill and the old mug with the crack shaped like a river delta. And then the beam flared back at him from a mirror he hadn't seen on the counter, and for one blessed second he was blind enough to tell the wind the truth about himself. He had no taste for slaughter. Age narrows a man's menu in more ways than the doctor warns you about. He preferred economy. He let the men move and took from them what they would be proud to have later: composure, polish, the right to believe the story would go as rehearsed. He wrote commas into their sentences with noise and then put periods where they would do the most good. A tire, not the front, not the rear, but the spare under the bed of the second truck, died with a sigh that sounded like somebody quitting a job he hated. A side mirror snapped its stem in the wind's fist and tattled its glass into the yard so loudly a man thought it was a shout. A tailgate learned a new word and would say it each time it closed from now on. Small, precise, the opposite of drama. Men who need drama for courage discovered they had brought the wrong gear. The commander adjusted. That was the measure of him. He didn't punish retreat. He didn't get louder to make the wind love him. He shifted his men to the lee side of their own idling, made the trucks his windbreak, and then sent 2 shapes low across the pasture in a curve that would in clean air have been pretty. He had found the basalt seam on his map and meant to make a stand there, or at least to deny it to the old man. The wind laughed at the intention, but it also made the darker ground look like water, and men who grew up in cities never quite trust the horizon when it moves. One of the 2 misread a darker gust as drop-off and checked his stride hard. the way a man leans back on a riverbank when he mistakes shadow for depth. The other vanished in a blow of dust, and, for a breath, even the land didn't know where he was. He had promised himself kindness if kindness did not turn into vanity. He gave those two a rope to climb back on their story with, around into a dry clump of prickly pear 3 yards wide, sound and spatter enough to make both heads rise to the correct level by instinct. Then he disappeared off that line completely. He had made the place a conversation between wind and habit. He refused to be the bore who interrupts. The duel began without a trumpet. It began with a feeling in his chest he recognized from a lifetime spent measuring distances that don't show up on maps. A pause on a ridgeline where no pause belonged. A flick, so small, where the horizon had been stitching itself to the earth a moment before. The storm was a gift to a patient man, but it was also a gift to a good one on the other side, and the commander had kept a piece of himself back all week, hidden where pressure doesn't reach. The old man settled into the window and let his cheekbone meet the stock with the softness of ritual. He watched for the tiny mistake ambition always makes when it believes the weather owes it courtesy. The first shot that came for him was honest. Not blind, not wild. It took the right guess at wind and then lost its nerve in the last 20 yards when a gust bucked and the bullet arrived high, shaving a curl from the porch post that spun once and vanished into dust. He did not answer with a shot. He answered with time. He counted a breath, 2, 3, letting his own pulse stretch until it could hold a decision without rushing it. He watched where the dust caught the gust and where it fell. He listened to his house, how the window frame clicked as the wind shouldered it, and took that click as the metronome. When the wind eased through that small notch where force stumbles into steady, he laid his answer across it like a plank over a ditch. The round landed where a man keeps his confidence. Not a kill, a correction. The commander went still, because stillness is the only dignity available to a proud man when the world informs him he is not the only craftsman alive. Then, because he was not only proud but disciplined, he shifted half a body width and took stock of both the wind and his own blood. The old man couldn't see the blood. He saw the math, the longer interval, the careful against lean, the choice to leave the men to their lesser tasks and keep the range between them clean of clutter. They traded discipline rather than noise. He took bark from a mesquite the commander had picked for a rest. The commander answered by clipping wind off a fence post 10 yards right of the kitchen and reminding him the house binds you to the ground in ways you forget until wood complains. He drifted left and let the storm erase his last footprint. The commander drifted right and let the dust right and then erase his as payment. The dog stayed utterly, magnificently still. The wind changed key. He set the seed of the end with a sentence, not a shot. The radio on the counter, tuned low to a weather channel that forgot to be boring, crackled. Beneath it, so faint a man would call it his imagination if he wanted an excuse, came the tale of a transmission that wasn't weather at all. Somewhere out there, a mic stayed keyed a beat too long, and a word slipped out that wasn't meant for anyone who hadn't paid dues. He didn't try to ride the frequency or play with knobs, he just listened. The commander said a name he shouldn't have said where the wind could carry it. A first name followed by a rank like nothing, half fond, half contempt, the tone men use to talk to tools that think they're people. The name belonged to the deputy. The wind delivered the syllables into the house like a receipt. You can ruin a man with proof, but you can also ruin him with timing. He let the duel go as far as it needed to go to make its own honest point. He saw the commander try the same solution twice, never a sin, sometimes wisdom, and watched the wind deny it both times. He adjusted his own hold a finger width, let the next lull walk toward him, and took a piece of hat brim by way of instruction. The commander smiled at the physics of it, visible even across a distance the storm wanted to eat. Then he moved to the place every map on Earth suggests to a man who hasn't learned the local superstition. The lip of a shallow bowl half full of gravel that looks like the inside of a good shot, all clean line and dignity. He had pre-dug that bowl 2 rains ago, not as a trap, but as honest labor to stop water from undercutting a fence post. He had thrown gravel there because gravel belongs where water wants to bully dirt. The packet beneath it, the one bad trick he allowed himself, wasn't a bomb or a snare. He isn't that man. It was a transponder the size of a key fob, resin-sealed, asleep until the weight of a man woke it and asked the sky to watch. He had tucked its sisters into 2 other bowls the land already owned. He hadn't planned where the commander would stand. He had guessed the way riverbeds guess men by knowing how we love clean curves. The ping went up and out with the wind and didn't care who owned air. A little green light 2 counties away, inside a brown sedan or perhaps a small office where coffee tastes like old decisions, woke. It did what it was paid to do. Write latitude and longitude in numbers. Even tired people can trust and push those numbers into the path of men who get out of bed when coordinates arrive. He had not asked anyone to come. He had simply told the world where to look if the world wanted to pretend it still kept records. The fight narrowed then, not wider, not crazier, narrowed the way a violin string tightens when the note must be pure. The men in the yard realized 2 things at once. Their radios had turned into wind chimes and the trucks had become both shelter and trap. They began to drift toward the fence that had always felt like edge and now felt like hope. The commander saw it and forbade panic by the simple act of not moving fast. Authority is often nothing more than the refusal to rush. He kept his eye on the window, on the seam, on the small signature's dust rights when a man's breath hits the barrel. The old man kept his eye on the dirt 5 yards short of the commander's boot, because that was where the wind played fair. 2 rounds crossed the middle too close together for dignity. He would never call them lucky. Luck offends what he knows. They were honest guesses that refused to be bullied by hurry. One took the commander high on the arm and shaved pride into shock. The other broke the stock of the rifle he had chosen for this night and made him drop into the bowl he had trusted and find his knees. He stayed there, a man who understood that sometimes the best move is to make none and let the world show which way it wants to fall. He didn't shoot him there. He could have. The wind would have applauded. The dust would have closed over all of it like paper burned clean. He waited instead. He gave the commander the long count he would have wanted himself if the storm had made a different decision earlier in his life. The commander breathed, checked his own blood, made a decision that was not vanity, and raised his empty hand. He kept the other pressed to the wound to honor his own heart's labor. When he spoke, the wind took most of it, but it left enough. "Enough," the commander said. Not sorry, not brave, just accurate. The yard heard it. Men straightened without feeling strong. The storm agreed in its way, flinging one last hard gust at the cottonwoods and then dropping its shoulders a fraction. Engines idled down. A door, only one, opened with human care and closed with the politeness of hands that have learned humiliation. A radio that had been held too long away from a mouth found a mouth again and let out a syllable that meant retreat without disgrace. The trucks turned with the slow, messy ballet of anything heavy in sand. They made the fence their exit and didn't count how many staples they broke. They fled, yes, but without the lying speed that ruins the last of a man's self-respect. The commander stayed, knees in gravel, because leaving would have turned a tactic into a sin against himself. The storm held just enough to hide the approach of the brown sedan. Not immediately, nothing in the desert happens when you want it, but in time to avoid the part of the story where townspeople stand in doorways with their arms folded, pretending they don't care. Tires whispered in dust. Doors didn't slam. Coats did not flap. No one shouted. Men in plain clothes move differently. The air doesn't have to teach them how to be quiet. One of them set his palm out to the commander the way a decent man offers another decent man a step up. The commander looked at the hand, then at the house, then at the sky. He made himself stand under his own power and kept his mouth silent because he had nothing useful to give to the wind anymore. The deputy arrived late enough to be guilty, not late enough to be innocent. His light bar did its dumb disco in dust that no one needed lit. He stepped out with his notebook open at last, as if ink had decided to be courage. He announced himself to men who did not need announcing, and tried to stand somewhere between the brown sedan and the house, which is a place a man cannot stand without confessing. He tied himself in a knot of sentences about reports and jurisdiction, and how the county values partnerships. No one interrupted him. The wind did. A voice on a recorder in a coat pocket cleared its throat. Then the brown sedan's door opened softly, and a man with the patient face of long paperwork held up a phone and asked the deputy whether he wanted to hear himself talk to his friend in the wind again. The deputy's mouth tried 3 shapes and found none. He looked at the commander, who had the grace not to look back. He looked at the house, and the house did not blink. He looked at the cottonwoods, which are kind to men because trees don't know what we do to each other. Then he sat on his own bumper like somebody had told him to sit when he was 12 and wouldn't stop throwing rocks. He gave up his radio. He gave up his badge. He gave up his name by keeping it. The evidence made a neat package only because the week had been messy. Photos, even the bad ones taken through dust, counted faces the way rain counts roof tin. Shell casings in baggies told the boring truth, which is the kind you can use. 2 envelopes from the feed store's back office, sealed days ago and handed over with a look that was more prayer than business, gave dates and times and head stamps and tire tread patterns and the way the base of the engines changed on the county road, when a certain weight ran a certain speed. Someone from the brown sedan touched nothing and wrote it all down as if writing could keep men honest tomorrow. It can't. But it helps. He didn't stand on the porch for any of it. He worked. He fetched water for the commander without blinking at the blood on the man's sleeve. He lifted the hood on the truck and fastened it so the wind would stop scolding it. He pegged the kitchen towel over the broken glass where a pane had been, not to fix anything, only to keep the house from feeling ashamed of showing its bones. He spoke to the dog in the tone he used when storms thundered in summer, and she needed to know the sky wasn't mad at her in particular. Dawn came ink to smoke to pearl. The storm, spent and proud of itself, wandered off to show other towns what happens when men mistake air for ally. The cottonwoods unbent 1 inch at a time. The desert, which forgives more than seems wise, smoothed the yard with a light hand. A hawk tacked along the edge of morning as if to read the drafts left behind by human vanity. The trucks were gone. The brown sedan stayed until papers had hands on them that could be sued later if it all turned into a story about how nothing is anyone's fault. He signed nothing. He told nothing he hadn't already put on paper in his own small, neat, stubborn hand. He accepted nothing that had to be repaid with anything but quiet. When the men with patient faces thanked him with the way their shoulders dropped 1/2 inch, the highest form of thank you in the trait of keeping order, he nodded. He wished the commander what he wished any man he had crossed range with and not had to bury. A chance to wrestle with himself in a room without windows until he either liked or hated what he found enough to stop. The deputy rode away in the back of a different car, window up so dust wouldn't mock him. He didn't wave, he didn't beg. He had the courage to look at his own boots when the town's only true mirror, the desert, asked him what story he planned to tell about himself 7 years from now when a kid in a new uniform asked him where it all went wrong. That counted for something. Not much. Enough. The house exhaled. The dog stretched and turned a slow circle and made the sound old dogs make when everything hurts and nothing is broken. He walked the yard with a coffee can and picked brass that didn't belong and pebbles kicked up by bullets that belonged to no one anymore. He set the can on the porch step, not as a trophy, but as a memory, which is a different thing. He wiped the kitchen table clean of dust and left the mug with the crack alone for 1 more day. He raked the barn ruin until its edges looked less like an accusation and more like a fact. He hammered the latch on the gate back into a shape that could hold itself shut. In town, the diner did what diners do. It turned gossip into calories and sent it out with eggs. He didn't go. He left 3 envelopes on the feed store counter. Receipts, a plain note about lumber, another about wire and staples, and tipped his hat to the bookkeeper as if the week hadn't rewritten the county in a small way. She nodded as if she had always known it would. She slid the envelopes into a drawer with others that mattered and others that did not. She handed him a sack with more feed than he had paid for. He did not argue. You don't argue with grace when it remembers your name. When he got home, the dog ran the fence and then pretended she had been dignified all along. The horses looked at him with the tiny, wise contempt horses reserve for humans who set the sky on fire and then ask hay to fix it. He tossed them flakes and spoke their names in order. He checked the legal pad and crossed one line out not because it had become untrue, but because it had been paid in full. He wrote one more line in ink, a thing he almost never did because pencil forgives errors better. He wrote, "Range keeps the count." He underlined it once, lightly, so the paper wouldn't bruise. He oiled the rifle with the same calm he had used to prepare the kettle. He didn't replace the stock until afternoon. He took his time fitting the new to the old, listening for the small argument wood makes before it agrees to belong. He set the rifle in the rack where it lived when it wasn't needed and closed the closet door as if closing a hymnal. He swept the porch clean. He straightened the doormat. He turned the broken lantern globe in his hand once and then set it on a shelf in the shed to wait for a use neither of them could name yet. A hawk shadow crossed the yard at 4:30, the winter hour that isn't really winter. He glanced at the skull half buried near the arroyo bend and saw the small shadow catch there for a heartbeat, right on time, like a man showing up at a shift he hadn't missed in 20 years. Some people call that luck. He calls it the honest dignity of keeping a schedule in a world that doesn't love you back unless you love it first. By sunset, the place had gone back to telling the same old lies that keep us sane, that work keeps trouble away, that fences stay where we hammer them, that a good dog solves more than she causes, that men who come to your gate with plans will move along if you feed them dust and grammar. He didn't believe the lies the way a child does. He believed them the way a man does who knows the price of disbelief is a life spent waiting on a flash in the dark that may never arrive. He slept then, not the warrior's sleep. There is no such thing, and anyone who says so is selling you a shirt. But the sleep of a man who has done the work before him and knows the work behind him will stay put until morning. The wind talked to the house in its polite voice, a murmur around the eaves like family catching up in a kitchen after a funeral. The dog dreamed with a twitch or two and didn't wake herself with them. The stars got on with their old business of being nothing like us and therefore oddly comforting. In the weeks that followed, the route shifted again, as routes do. Men who draw maps on napkins in rooms far from dust learned new towns to pronounce badly. The county found its spine where it had mislaid it and shined it up for meetings. The brown sedan stopped by once more, polite to a fault, to ask if he needed anything practical. He said he needed fence staples and laughter. They provided the former and tried shyly at the latter. The deputy's replacement came out one morning and walked the fence with him without pretending his trousers were too good for dirt. They didn't talk about the old deputy. They fixed 2 loose wires and called it even. He rebuilt the barn slowly, with boards that had lived through something. He set the doorway a foot wider. Not for reasons he could defend in an argument, but because the sight of a wide mouth on a building makes a man feel the world is a little less stingy. He planted a 4th cottonwood where the barn's eave would cast a sliver of afternoon shade on the trough when summer came around mean and bright. He kept the missing bark segment from the first night and hung it on a nail in the shed where it could remind him how close courtesy and cowardice often stand to each other in a yard. On a clear evening, when the horizon remembered how to hold a sunset without spilling, he took the dog out to the basalt seam and lay down where the rock knew his ribs. He looked across 800 yards of honest air to the place where he and the commander had each bet on wind. He told the land what he always tells it when it has saved him from something he didn't deserve to survive. "Thank you, and I know we're even only until morning." He did not think about legend. Legends belong in bars and in the mouths of men who need a topic. He thought about chores and bread and how much wire he had left in the roll. He thought about the feel of the stock against his cheek and the way his dog's breathing slowed when he matched it. And he thought about the quiet distances he had carried in his chest all his life like notes on a staff only he could read. At sunrise, he rose. The desert didn't congratulate him. The sky didn't give him a ribbon. The kettle rattled once on the iron stove and fell still. He poured coffee strong enough to float a horseshoe and stood at the back door until the blue bled off the mesquite. When the light turned the color of a clean bone, he stepped out with a coil of wire over one shoulder and a tool bag in the other hand, and he walked his fence. The land did what land does when a man listens. It kept its counsel and let him belong.